Hi there, Michael here. Have you ever had a perfectly produced stereo track and wondered what's the easiest and cheapest way to turn this into a multi-channel mix so that you can use that in Adobe Atmos production without changing how the stereo downmix sounds? In other words, how do you add a 7.1.4 or 9.1.6 multi-channel mix to an existing stereo track while keeping the stereo full down exactly the same? Well, I certainly have, quite often actually. If this sounds familiar to you, today's video is for you. I'm going to show you an exciting new way to create a multi-channel mix from your stereo tracks using a plugin called Eno, the Immersive Nulling Up Mixer. We will create a 9.1.6 mix, but the plugin can handle other channel layouts as well. The best part, the entire process is incredibly simple, fast, and super affordable. So let's jump right in. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. Sam Hocking, the developer of Eno, is a good friend of mine and co-hosts our immersive audio podcast Spatial Audio Monthly. You'll find a link in the description. That said, I genuinely believe Eno is one of the most interesting developments in immersive audio in recent years. To our knowledge, nothing identical exists on the market today, and while plugins that allow you to achieve something similar cost hundreds of dollars, Sam's Eno plugin is available for just 29 British pounds. And to be clear, although Sam is a friend, this isn't a sponsored video. No money has or will exchange hands between us from Eno sales. And one final comment, this video is actually a reshoot of an earlier video that I decided to take down because Sam changed the name as well as a few features of the plugin shortly after its release. Some of the things I said in that video were therefore no longer fully accurate. If you want to check out the original video, which does include additional tips and tricks that I'm not going to talk about today, such as how to integrate head tracking with Eno, you can do that on Patreon. A link is in the description below. But enough said, let's open up Reaper and start using Eno to turn an existing stereo track into a 9.1.6 multi-channel track, ready to be integrated into a Dolby Atmos project. I'm going to work with Reaper today and I'm going to work on a Mac, but be aware that everything that I'm going to show you works in Windows in exactly the same way. What I have here is a very simple Reaper project that consists of one stereo track. That stereo track is actually an AI-generated track from Suno. Now, in case you're wondering why I'm using AI-generated tracks, this is primarily because AI-generated tracks cannot be copyrighted, so nobody can claim the copyright of the track later on. At least that's the theory, but nevertheless, let's just have a brief listen.
Digital waves in stereo flight, transformed into dimensions of light. Atmos takes us higher tonight, preserving the essence, making it right. Newland waves, they dance and flow, from stereo to Atmos, watch it grow.
Okay, so what we want to do now is we want to turn that into a 9.1.6 immersive audio track that we could use later, for example, in a Dolby Atmos session. And we want to do that in a way that preserves the stereo fold down as much as possible. And the way we're going to do that is with the Eno plugin. You can download Eno from the demix.me website. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. Now, it is important to understand that Eno is actually not a compiled plugin. What it really is a plug data patch, or actually a pure data patch. Now, if you're not familiar with that, that is sort of a system that is very, very similar to Max for Live. So if you're an Ableton user and you're used to working with Max for Live devices, pure data is essentially the same thing, just not for Ableton, but for everybody else. So in order to be able to run that, we not only need the Eno plugin or the Eno plug data patch, we also need to download plug data itself, and that fortunately is completely free. And once again, I'm going to leave a link in the description below. You can get that from the plug data website. What you need to do is you need to go to the download section and here download whatever plug data format you need for whatever operating system that you're going to use. Now, one thing that is important to note here is that plug data is not available in AAX format. So if you are a Pro Tools user, you're unfortunately out of luck. Sam Hocking, the developer of Eno, plans to provide or to create a compiled version for AAX users so that you can use that in the future. But for the moment being, plug data is not available for AAX, and therefore what I'm going to show you today with Eno, you cannot use in Pro Tools, you would have to go to Reaper in order to do that. So after downloading the Plug Data plugin and installing it on your system and also downloading the Eno Plug Data patch, we are now ready to convert our stereo track into 9.1.6. Now the first thing that we need to do is we need to change the channel layout of that track to 9.1.6, so essentially to 16 channels. So I'm going to go into the channel settings here, and I'm going to change the track channels from 2 channels to 16 channels so that I can hold a 9.1.6 track. And then I'm going to add an instance of the Plug Data plugin. So let's just search for Plug Data. We need to use the Plug Data FX plugin. You can use whatever plugin format you want to use. I'm going to use VST3 here, but whatever you want to use is fine. And let's add that. Now, as soon as I add that, it's going to come up with the user interface, and it's going to ask me to load a Plug Data patch. Now, I've already opened Eno once a little bit earlier today when I tested everything. So I could simply click here on recently opened, or I can also just open the patch, and that's what I'm going to do. And going to kind of go to the directory where I have downloaded Eno, the Plug Data in Plug Data format. I'm going to open that, and as soon as I open that, I see the user interface available to me. Now you might wonder, do I have to do that every time I'm going to use Eno now? And the answer to that obviously is no. First of all, if I'm saving that Reaper session, I'm going to reopen that. Obviously, Plug Data is going to remember what patch has been used, and it's just going to load that in. And then you can simply save that as a preset. And in the future, instead of opening up Plug Data, just opening up the preset, and that would load Eno directly. So you don't have to do that every time, but you obviously have to do that the first time you're going to use it. Now, I'm not going to work with a 9.1.6 studio environment here because I'm making a YouTube video, and YouTube is primarily stereo. So in order for you guys to actually hear something, what I now need to do is I need to convert it back to stereo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer for that purpose, and I'm going to use the free version. This will allow me to take the 9.1.6 and run that through an Atmos conversion and bring that back into stereo so that you guys hear what I'm hearing. So let's do that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer to the master track. So let me search for Composer. And here we are. And once again, there are 2 versions. There's a paid version, there's a free version. I'm going to use the free version today. You can simply go to the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer site and just download that. It's completely free. And it's actually a really nice system that allows you to get your hands dirty with Dolby Atmos. And that's actually really, really nice. So the next thing I need to do is I need to add the Fiedler Audio Beam plugin. That Beam plugin will be responsible for sending the 9.1.6 into the Dolby Atmos Composer. Once again, I'm going to use the Essentials version here. I'm going to add that. As soon as I've added the Beam plugin, it will now direct the audio not through the regular routing system, but instead from the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin directly into the Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, I'm going to make a couple of adjustments just to be on the safe side. First of all, in the Dolby Atmos Composer, I'm going to set this composite to 9.1.6 because I want to use 9.1.6. And then I'm going to go into the Fiedler Audio Beam plugin, and I'm just going to reset the objects here. I find that particularly useful because it sometimes kind of gives the wrong order of those channels, and just resetting that should make everything perfectly fine. So now the audio is sent into the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer Essential. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the monitoring from binaural to stereo. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want you guys to hear that there's actually not a lot of difference. And actually, in theory, there's no difference. But unfortunately, the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer adds a little bit of processing. So there will be a very, very minor difference that you will most likely not be able to hear. But essentially, the idea is that I'm creating a down mix that sounds as close to the original as possible. That's what I'm doing here. And the final thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into the routing sections. I'm going to deselect the master send because the audio is now sent from the Beam plugin into the Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, this would technically not be necessary because essentially the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer is not supposed to let any audio through, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to deselect that. And if I'm playing the audio now, I should already hear something. So let's play our audio. And you can see the Eno plugin is already upmixing to our 9.1.6, and these channels are arriving at the Fiedler Audio Composer and are going to be converted into stereo. Now, before I continue, there's one important point I want to make, and that is in the original video where I showed you how to use the old version of the Eno plugin, I focused on the idea that you can use that in order to convert a stereo track into a Dolby Atmos track, because that is what it is right now. We have taken the stereo track, converted it to 9.1.6, routed that into the Fiedel Audio Dolby Atmos Composer, and if I now use the Fiedel Audio Dolby Atmos Composer in order to export that, I can export an Atmos file, and that Atmos file sounds exactly like the original stereo track, with the only difference is that it is now an Atmos track. Now, a lot of people got very upset about that with me, and the reason for that is because Apple does not allow you to do that. So there are actually regulations, should I call them regulations? There are certain things that you're supposed to do, and one of the things that you're not supposed to do is you're not supposed to take a stereo track and upmix that and then kind of submit that as a Dolby Atmos track. Now, I have to be perfectly honest, I'm not an Apple hater by any means. I'm actually living in the Apple ecosystem. Everything that I do is either Mac-based or iOS-based. I do have a Windows system, and I also use that in my videos as well, but I prefer to use Mac systems. And I've actually just ordered a new MacBook that was ridiculously expensive, so I'm everything but an Apple hater. But I have to say that, I find it slightly odd that people are so passionate about things, about regulations, limitations that a company kind of puts out. My personal opinion about that is if it sounds good, it is good. And quite frankly, sometimes you simply don't have the option to create a real Dolby Atmos mix, right? So sometimes you have a stereo track where you no longer have the session that you used in order to create that. Or maybe you have a track like I have here, which is an artificial intelligence generated track where there is no session at all. And I don't see any problems with using an upmixing solution in order to convert that into Dolby Atmos. Now, you need to be aware that that might mean that Apple might reject your Atmos track for the Apple distribution service. But in order to get around, all you would need to do is you would need to add a couple of additional objects, for example, that kind of add additional sound effects or additional instruments to your mix that would give it a slightly more immersive feel. So you could still use that as a starting point for an Atmos mix. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I find it slightly odd that people got so upset about that and people got very passionate about that. Yeah, Apple does not allow you to do that. You're kind of bad, Michael. Don't do that. And I think that is weird. If it sounds good, once again, it is good. And if you have a stereo track that there's no other way to convert it into Atmos than upmixing, then by all means, upmix. So that's my opinion. Let me know in the comments if you disagree with me. I would be interested if I'm alone with that. But I found it weird that people got so upset about that. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's now play our audio and start messing around with the Eno parameters. Now, before I do that, I need to point out one more thing, and that is because the Dolby Atmos Composer is doing some additional processing. What we're going to do here is not going to null completely. So if you follow my tutorial and then kind of try to null it, it's not going to null exactly. So just be aware of that. But you're not going to be able to hear much difference, to be perfectly honest. And that also means that everything that I'm going to do in the plugin here, you're not going to actually hear. In order to be able to really understand what's happening, you need to look at the meters here, and the meters will tell you sort of where we are going to move the audio towards. Are we going to move it to the front, to the back, to the top, to the bottom? That's only visible to you via the actual meters, and you're not going to hear much of a difference in the stereo fold down. So let's press play. Now, the way Eno works is that it separates the stereo audio into what is called a direct signal and a diffuse signal. And to understand the difference, just think about it in terms of mid signal and side signal. So the direct signal is sort of the mid signal, the mono signal, and the diffuse signal is the side signal. And what Eno allows us to do, it allows us to massage the direct signal and the diffuse signal and move it around in our three-dimensional space. And the way it does this is, first of all, it is taking the stereo audio and it is removing whatever you want to push into the LFE channel. And this is happening with this LFE push dial here. So if I'm increasing that, I will see more signal going into the LFE here. If I set it to 0, for example, it's going to disappear completely. And I can also change the cutoff, so essentially where the frequency range is that I'm going to push into the LFE. So if I want to push higher frequencies, I'm going to increase the cutoff, or I can also decrease that. And I also have the possibility to change the Q value here. Then the second thing is it's going to do the same thing for the center channel. So here I have the center push dial. The center push dial allows me to move audio into the center channel. So if I set that to 0, I'm going to have no signal in the center channel. If I increase that, it's going to send more center channel signal, or it's going to send more signal into the center channel. And I actually kind of can make that hearable by going into the Beam plugin, and in the Beam plugin what I'm going to do is I'm going to solo the center channel. Now I'm only hearing the center channel, so if I increase that, I get more signal in the center channel. Oopsie. If I reduce that, it's going to be less, down to 0. And then I also have here the shape parameter, and what the shape parameter does, it allows you to zoom in on the frequency that you want to push into the center channel. So this can be used, for example, if you want to push more of the vocals into the center channels, because the vocals live in a certain frequency range. So if I'm playing around with that, you will hear that the frequency that is pushed into the center channel changes. So I can zoom in on the vocals. So let's just wait until the vocals come in. So maybe here, something like here. Then I'm going to set that back and then unsolo that track. So after I've pushed the signal into the center channel and the LFE channel, the remaining signal is going to be distributed throughout the individual speakers. And the way I can change how much of that is sent into the surrounding speakers is with the center dial, which is the center direct push. This direct push essentially tells me how much of the direct signal is pushed into the diffuse field. So if I'm increasing that, you will see that the surround channels are going to increase in gain. So as you can see, the left and right channel is now not as dominant, and the surround channels are more dominant. If I'm kind of sent it back, essentially I have all of the direct signal sent into the left and right channel. And you can use that in order to move the direct signal kind of around in the three-dimensional space. Then I have the option to change how much is sent into the height channels with the height push. So if I'm increasing the height push, more signal is going into the height channels. If I'm removing that, more signal is going into the bottom channels. So let's put that here somewhere in the middle. Then I have the option to change the balance between front and front and rear, sorry. So here I have more in the front. So let's set that. And here if I change that to rear. So here I have more in the rear channels. You have more in the front channels. And then I can choose what I'm going to do with the diffuse signal. So essentially I can push that more towards the essentially surrounding speakers or more towards the left and right. And that can be done with the push button. Then I also have the option to change where the diffuse signals lives, more towards the front or more towards the rear. So I can, for example, do everything to the front or to the rear. Now it's more signal in the rear. So let's just reset that. And that essentially allows you to kind of move the stereo track around in three-dimensional space and fill out the kind of three-dimensional space with a 9.1.6 upmix that once again folds down neatly towards the stereo track. So you're not going to hear much difference here. So once again, if you're actually doing the nulling, it's not going to null completely, and that is because of the field-loaded Dolby Atmos composer doing some additional processing. But effectively, you can't really hear any difference. So if I'm moving that around, even though I'm changing the signal substantially, you're actually not going to hear much of a difference here. And that also means that if you want to really understand what's happening here, is you need to have either a full Dolby Atmos music studio with a 9.1.6 speakers layout, so kind of really full-blown Dolby Atmos music studio, or alternatively you can also use a head tracking solution. And in the original video that I created about this plugin, I actually showed how to set up the head tracking. So if you want to know how to do that, I invite you to go over to my Patreon and become a Patreon member, and through the Patreon membership you can actually access the original video that I created about this plugin. And in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to set up the head tracking, and if there's enough interest I might actually do a second video here on the main channel as well, so that everybody who does not want to become a Patreon can watch that as well. Let me know in the comment section if this is something that you're really interested in. I can do another video if you want to. So since the original release of the plugin, the developer has also added a couple of really interesting and useful features. So one thing that he added, for example, is you can now also switch over to different channel layouts. So if you're not working with 9.1.6, you can switch over to 7.1.4 or 5.1.2. And you also have the option to change to two different channel layouts. So some people want to work with the film layout, so you can simply do that. Then essentially the channel layout is moved around so that everything is kind of matched correctly with the film layout for 9.1.6. And then there's one additional feature that I find really cool, and that is this little boxes here. If you click on them, it will give you a little kind of white noise, and that allows you to identify where exactly the speakers are. And I think that is actually really, really useful. So once again, a really interesting plugin that can be very useful if you're working with immersive audio. It is not that expensive. Now, unfortunately, there is no trial version, and that it has to do with the fact that it is distributed as a pure data patch. And because it is distributed as a pure data patch, you essentially get the source code. So you could technically even change things that you don't like. So if you don't like the interface, you can change that. If you want to add additional features and you know how to work with pure data, you can do that as well. And because it is distributed in source code format, the developer couldn't really find a reasonable solution to give you a trial version. But once again, it's not that expensive. So if you're working with immersive audio and have any interest in upmixing, I highly recommend getting that one. Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description below. Our Discord is also the best place to connect with Sam Hawking, the developer of Eno, if you have any specific questions about the Eno plugin. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated about all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.